Everyone remembers the affair. A young queen, a handsome courtier, secret meetings on a royal progress, arranged by a lady-in-waiting who kept watch on the stairs, a love letter in the queen's own hand. I never longed so much for a thing as I do to see you. It is the story you've been told about Katherine Howard, the foolish girl who threw away a crown for a man named Thomas Culpeper. There is just one problem with it. No one ever proved it happened. The affair the whole world remembers was never demonstrated in any court because there was no court, and the crime Katherine Howard was actually executed for was not adultery at all. It was a crime that did not exist on the day she married. They had to write it first. To understand how she died, you have to start years before the throne, in a house full of children that no one was really watching. Katherine was a Howard, niece of the Duke of Norfolk, first cousin to a queen already dead, Anne Boleyn, but her own branch of the family was poor. Her father was a younger son who inherited nothing and spent his life begging from richer relatives. So Katherine, one of 10 children, was sent off to be raised by her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, in a crowded household at Lambeth, where supervision was famously lax, and where young women and grown men mixed freely after dark. We don't know exactly how old she was. We don't even know the year she was born. Somewhere between 1518 and 1524. The best modern work puts it around 1522 or 23, which would make her a child of about 13 for what came next. What came next was a man named Henry VIII, her music teacher. By the confessions both of them would later give, Manox and the girl engaged in sexual contact, though not, they each said, the full act. And here the historians genuinely divide, so I'm going to give you both and let you sit with it. One major reading is that this was grooming, an older man preying on a child of 13 or 14. Another, from her most thorough modern biographer, holds that Manox was roughly her own age, that it was briefer than that, and inappropriate on several levels, but not predation. You will notice the dispute turns entirely on a birth date nobody can confirm. Hold on to that. It is going to matter at the end. Katherine ended it with Manox, and then came the man who would, years later, help kill her, Francis Dereham. Dereham was a gentleman of the household, older, and the relationship was serious and sexual. They exchanged gifts. They called each other husband and wife. And in Tudor law, that phrasing was not romantic decoration. To call each other husband and wife, to exchange a promise and then sleep together, could create a precontract, a binding marriage in the eyes of the church without any ceremony at all. Remember that word, precontract. It is the loaded gun on the mantelpiece in Act 1. When Katherine was later questioned about Dereham, she did not describe a romance. She said he had, by many persuasions, procured me to his vicious purpose, and she spoke of the subtle persuasions of young men and the ignorance and frailty of young women. Some historians read that as the language of coercion, even in the bluntest modern accounts of rape. Others read the Lambeth years as something she had wanted. I'll only say this, those are her words, not a screenwriter's. And they don't sound like nostalgia. In 1539, the Duke of Norfolk pulled his obscure, penniless niece out of that household and placed her at the very center of England, as a maid of honor to the king's incoming fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. The timing was not innocent. Norfolk led the conservative, Catholic-leaning faction at court, and they were losing to Thomas Cromwell. A pretty Howard girl in the king's eyeline was a weapon. It worked immediately. Henry, 49, enormous, his leg ulcerating, was smitten with a teenager. He annulled the Cleves marriage on the 9th of July, 1540, and on the 28th of July, he married Catherine at Oatlands Palace. On that exact same day, a few miles away, Thomas Cromwell, the most powerful minister in England, was beheaded. The wedding and the execution were the same afternoon. The court that made Catherine queen had just shown her, in the plainest possible terms, what it did to people it was finished with. She was about 17. He called her his rose without a thorn. She took as her motto a single submissive line, "No other will but his." And for a year it was good. The king was besotted, the girl was joyful, there was talk of a coronation, of a child. But the household at Lambeth had not forgotten her. As her old companions watched her rise, they came, not with congratulations, but with their hands out. People who knew what she had done as a girl wanted positions, and silence has a price. So Catherine made the most disastrous appointments of her life. She brought her old music master, Manox, into her musicians, and she made Francis Dereham, the man with the pre-contract, her private secretary. She had surrounded the throne with the only people alive who could destroy her. In the summer of 1541, Henry took Catherine on a grand progress north, to overawe the part of England that had rebelled against him years before. 5,000 horse, half the Privy Council, the full theatre of Tudor power on the move. And somewhere in those crowded, shifting lodgings, Catherine began meeting privately with Thomas Culpeper, a young, favoured gentleman of the king's own privy chamber. The meetings were arranged by one of her ladies, Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, the widow of George Boleyn, sister-in-law to the executed Anne. She kept watch. She managed the doors. Here is where I have to stop the music, because here is where the legend runs ahead of the evidence. We do not know what happened in those rooms. It is genuinely unclear whether Catherine and Culpeper ever committed adultery at all. The intensity of it suggests something real, but suggestion is not proof, and proof is exactly what never arrived. What we do have is the letter. It survives to this day in her own hand. It is not explicit. It is something worse for her. It is tender. She writes that she never longed so much for a thing as to see him, that it makes her heart to die to think of him leaving. And then comes the line that was not romance, but operations, the line that names her accomplice in her own writing. "Come," she tells him, "when my Lady Rochford is here, for then I shall be best at leisure to be at your commandment." She signs it, "Yours, as long as life endures." It would not be a long life. The end did not begin with Culpeper. It began with a job interview. A Protestant reformer named John Lascelles had a sister, Mary Hall, who had served in that same Lambeth household. Lascelles wanted her to seek a place in the new Queen's chamber. Mary refused, and told him why. She had seen, she said, how light Catherine had been, and she named Manox and Dereham. Lascelles was no friend of the Catholic Howards, and he understood instantly what he was holding. He took it to Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who was no friend of the Howards either. But the trigger was real, not merely political. If Catherine had a pre-contract with Dereham, her marriage to the king was void. On All Souls' Day, the 2nd of November, 1541, Cranmer put it in writing and gave it to the king, saying he had not the heart to speak it aloud. Henry didn't believe it. He thought it was a forgery, a slander, and ordered a quiet investigation to clear her name. It did the opposite. Manox was questioned first and admitted the early contact and pointed forward at Dereham. Dereham and Culpeper were arrested and taken to the Tower, where they confessed under torture. Catherine, confined to her rooms, screamed for the king as they took her. He never saw her again. Cranmer interrogated her himself and found her in such grief, he wrote, that it would have pitied any man's heart. And now the trap closes with a terrible irony. Catherine confessed to her past with Dereham, but denied there had ever been a pre-contract. She denied the one thing that could have saved her, because a pre-contract would have meant she was never truly the king's wife. humiliating, ruinous, but survivable. Her step-grandmother understood the logic exactly. If there be no offense since the marriage, she cannot die for what was done before. She was wrong, because they were about to change what counted as an offense. In late January 1542, Parliament took up a bill of attainder, condemnation by statute with no trial, and the new law it carried was extraordinary. It made it treason, punishable by death, for a queen to fail to disclose her sexual history to the king within 20 days of the marriage. Read that again: not adultery, non-disclosure, a crime built specifically to fit a woman whose only proven conduct had happened years before she ever met him, and applied to her retroactively, after the fact, for behavior that broke no law on the day she did it. It dissolved the whole messy question of the pre-contract and made her, in the words of the record, unequivocally guilty. There was no trial, there was a vote. Dereham was hanged, drawn and quartered, Culpeper beheaded. Their heads went up on London Bridge. And there is one last detail that tells you what kind of machine this was. Lady Rochford, who had kept watch on the stairs, suffered a complete mental collapse in the Tower. Under English law, you could not execute the insane, so Parliament simply passed another act, one that permitted the execution of the insane for treason. When the law did not fit the need, they reshaped the law. On the 10th of February, they took Catherine by barge to the Tower. As she passed under London Bridge, she would have seen what was left of Culpeper and Dereham mounted above her. The night before she died, it is said she asked for the block to be brought to her cell and practiced laying her head upon it so that she would do it correctly. We can't fully confirm that. It comes to us second-hand, but it has the awful ring of a frightened person trying to control the one thing left to control. At 7 in the morning, on the 13th of February, 1542, she was led out to Tower Green. She was pale and terrified and too weak to climb the scaffold without help. She gave the conventional speech, called her punishment worthy and just, asked for forgiveness and for prayers. An eyewitness noted her steadfast countenance. One stroke. She was perhaps 18, maybe 19, we still don't know. And no, despite what you may have heard, she did not say she would rather have died the wife of Culpeper. No eyewitness recorded those words. She died with the careful, conventional script of the condemned. The romantic last line was added later by people who preferred the love story to the truth. Lady Rochford was beheaded moments after her. They were buried side by side in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, a few feet from Catherine's cousin, Anne Boleyn, dead not 6 years before, in almost exactly the same way. So let's pass a verdict, and let's be honest about who was actually on trial. The story you inherited is a morality tale, a vain girl who couldn't keep her crown, undone by her own appetite. I want to throw that one out, because it doesn't survive contact with the record. Start with what she was killed for, not the affair. That was never proven, and there was no court to prove it in. She was executed under a law invented weeks earlier, applied backward, that made it a capital crime to have a past and not confess it. That is not justice catching up with a criminal. That is a state deciding on the outcome and then writing the statute to reach it. The same move it made for Cromwell on her wedding day. The same move it would make again. On this channel, we keep saying the state rarely needs a knife. It needs a signature. Katherine Howard is the purest case we have. They didn't even need a real crime. They wrote one. And then there is the part the love story is designed to make you forget. If you go looking, in this whole sordid file, for conduct a decent person today would actually call criminal, you do find some. But it isn't the Queen's. It's a music master and a household man and a girl of maybe 13 in a house where no adult was watching. Whatever you conclude about those years, and serious historians still argue about them, The one person in that room who could not have been the offender was the child. She was never tried for that. No one was. She was the victim of it. And 9 years later, the same society that failed to protect that girl executed the woman she became for the crime of having been her. That's the case, not a foolish queen who gambled and lost. A child the system used, and then the system killed, and called it justice because it had just finished writing the law that said so. This was Crown and Scaffold, where the throne met the block.